Yeah, thank you, Rue. Can you all hear me?
You're a little quiet, Beth.
Okay. I'm very happy to introduce Gavin Fay. He works as a postdoctoral research associate at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center, where he's working with Jason Link on incorporating ecosystem modeling into ecosystem-based management. Gavin has a master's and a PhD from the University of Washington, and he has a bachelor's in science from the University of Stirling in Scotland. While he was at Washington, he worked on stellar sea lions, so he's both a Stirling guy and a stellar guy, so we're lucky to have him. He also worked for a time at CSIRO, the organization within Australia, so he has experience from other places. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what he has to tell us about ocean acidification effects included into fisheries population and ecosystem modeling. Take it away, Gavin.
Thanks, Beth, for that great introduction. I don't want to say stellar introduction because you already stole that. I just want to thank everybody for joining today, and thanks to Cassie, Beth, and Rue for the opportunity to give this talk to you all. Can everybody see my screen okay?
Yes, we can.
Great. So today, as Beth said, I'm going to give a brief talk about methods for including ocean acidification effects in models that are used for fisheries assessment and also ecosystem assessment. My intent today is to give a broad overview of methodology, in which case I'm going to draw on some examples from around the globe before getting into some of my own work here in the Northeast US, which is involving putting ocean acidification effects into an end-to-end marine ecosystem model for the Northeast US continental shelf. I need to acknowledge contributions from co-authors and collaborators, including folks both at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center in Woods Hole and Narragansett, and then also in Australia and in Seattle, both at the University of Washington and CSIRO. And as you'll see as I go through this talk, the folks in Australia have really been thinking about a lot of these things, and I think there's some really great opportunity to draw on a lot of really great work with regard to ecosystem modeling. So why would we want to put acidification effects into models for living marine resource management? Well, we're all here. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the effects of ocean acidification because we've had lots of great presentations during this series on the specifics. But suffice to say that there are many mechanisms by which ocean acidification is thought to affect marine populations. If we look at syntheses of effects on a wide variety of taxa, so reviews such as this one by Croker show that there's potentially large effects, but also very variable effects, depending on the sorts of species you're looking at and the kinds of biological responses to ocean acidification that we want to consider. From a fisheries modeling and management perspective, we tend to be interested in socio-economic impacts of stresses on marine ecosystems. Typically, in fisheries assessment and management, this is concerned with fishing, but of course there are other environmental stresses too. In terms of the economic exposure of acidification effects, well, I think there's been lots of really great work showing that there is potential for large impacts. Here's a figure from a great paper by Sarah Cooley and Scott Doney from a few years ago in terms of trying to quantify just vulnerability or potential vulnerability of the total fisheries catch to ocean acidification effects. Really, the warmer colors here indicate, species or species groups that are thought to be more vulnerable, and you can see that there's a lot of variability by region. We're on the left there, North America, and of course this is integrating across all coasts. But you can see there's clearly some potential here for significant effects. This picture changes quite substantially if we start to look about it in terms of economics rather than just biomass. You can see the large percentage of the economic value of fisheries yield is potentially impacted by ocean acidification. So models really provide an opportunity for integrating the information on biological responses to stresses such as acidification to the population and ecosystem level, which perhaps allows us to quantify responses in terms of fisheries yield and socio and societal economic impacts. I really like this figure from a review paper a couple of years ago in terms of showing where things sit, and the acidification effects we tend to think of those as affecting processes at the cellular, chemical, or organismal level, but from a fisheries management perspective, we tend to be really interested in changes at the population or ecosystem level, and the challenge then is integrating that information at those other scales to ones that are relevant for management. And I think really, our modeling toolbox allows us to get at some of these questions. Well, the modeling toolbox that as fisheries biologists have and ecosystem assessment biologists have is very diverse. But what I want to stress is that really a lot of these models are really very simple in terms of we're looking at population processes and can really be distilled down into this population dynamics 101 type approach, in that when we're modeling the numbers or the biomass of living marine resources out there, we're really concerned with very few processes, and the variety of models that we have available to use can be very complicated, they can be very simple. I'm thinking, we range from simple biomass dynamics models where we are simply looking at this equation right here versus age structure models, models that account for species interactions, models that account for spatial structure in habitat and species distribution, up to models that try to model everything from sunlight filtering down and lower trophic levels and food pathways to upper trophic levels and then to fisheries, and then integrate management and human uses beyond fishing into the processes. But really, at the end of the day, when we're thinking about trying to incorporate effects of stresses such as ocean acidification, it's a case of thinking about where in these equations we're going to incorporate those effects at the population level. And so really, most of the work on including environmental factors in fisheries and fisheries models is a case of identifying parameters in the functions that are used to model some of these larger scale processes, and to try and identify mechanisms that are responsible for modifying those parameters, and for the modeler to sit down perhaps with a larger group of people and try and work through how exactly to integrate those effects into these rather broad terms that I'm putting down here. what I want to do is briefly talk about some single species examples before going on to some ecosystem models. Now, there's a very large literature out there on methods for including environmental factors into stock assessment models specifically, and also how to deal with including these things in management strategies. Now, I bring very little of this literature is to do with ocean acidification, but I wanted to highlight it because really the methods and approaches that are covered in there's two excellent reviews here, one focusing on assessment methods and the other on testing management strategies, are really the approaches that have been developed for looking at environmental or climate factors or just time varying parameters in general, really can, I think, provide a lot of insight for dealing with including ocean acidification. Now, generally the focus it tends to be on identifying mechanisms, so for population processes, so which parameters are likely to be affected within the model. Then possibly if we have some data from experiments or observations, we can maybe estimate some functional relationships between environmental covariates, so in this case perhaps ocean pH, and then biological parameters such as recruitment strength next year or mortality parameters. There's an emphasis on testing the performance of methods in the literature, and I really think this is a strength of modeling in that we can, rather than perhaps focus on specific predictions, we can use our models to explore the consequences of different scenarios for effects, and then also for the structural forms that we're using to represent effects of, say, ocean acidification within our models across a range of scenarios, and then really look at whether, you know, where the sensitivity of our results is compared to those assumptions, and can we draw broad conclusions that are useful, perhaps not in a tactical management sense, i.e. coming up with the catch next year, but perhaps a strategic assessment of how the effects of ocean acidification can be expected to influence responses both in fisheries and in economics. So really I want to stress the sort of broad scale testing and evaluation of plausible scenarios rather than, you know, specifically saying, well, next year we're going to have a catch that is X because ocean acidification is Y. So some examples of modifications of life history parameters. Many of you will be familiar with William Chung's work at the University of British Columbia. They have applied these bioclimatic envelope models, which are really looking at the sensitivity of growth parameters, or how sensitivity of growth parameters to changes in climate variables could potentially impact populations, and then scale that up to the catch potential. And they've shown that the results are quite variable. The sensitivity to ocean acidification is relatively moderate, but in some cases could be quite high. There's excuse me a second. A common feature of a lot of these models is that the information that we have for parameterizing them is perhaps lower than we might like, or not as species specific as we might like, and so, at least at the moment. And so assumptions such as scenario assumptions such as fixing parameters, you know, assuming certain responses, it has tended to be the way forward. And so in this case, it was a case of saying, okay, well, we think that that changes in pH will moderate demand for oxygen, and then using that in the metabolic model to look at how that would affect growth on individual spatial areas. So that example is not for a population dynamics model, it's an equilibrium model. An example from a more traditional sort of stock assessment model here, this is from a master's thesis, Dushanka Polshak at the University of Washington, who's a student of Andre Pantz. Her thesis focused on the Bristol Bay red king crab fishery, whether they could, they developed an approach to integrate changes in larval survival. I say larvae, and the crab folks out there will probably have better words, but so I apologize if the actual life stage is incorrect. But essentially what they did here was they used some experimental information to estimate a relationship between pH and larval survival. So those three figures at the top there, top and to the left, show the experiment. The solid light, the dots are the experimental data from 3 different levels of pH, and the lines represent some estimated curves with respect to survival as a function of time and pH. And you can see that, in particular, the nonlinear model seems to capture those observed changes in survival quite well. So what Dushanka then did was couple this relationship that they estimated to a more formal stock assessment model, which incorporates fishing, the effects of fishing and spawning dynamics over time, to try and evaluate how this change in the estimated change in the larval survival rate as a function of acidification might translate through to fisheries and economic yields. And what they found was that, unsurprisingly, with these very large changes in survival over time, predicted changes in survival over time, they have very large, substantial effects on the yield and profit functions. The maximum sustainable yield from the fishery declines substantially as you go forwards through time on the projections, and also not only the total amount of yield, but the rate of fishing mortality that is associated with perhaps sustainable reference points also declines as a function of that predicted change in pH over time. So this is an integration of both observational experimental data with modeling and also with climate projections of changes in pH into the future. So this really is a very common framework that's been applied, as I say, not to ocean acidification, but to other effects. And there's also work ongoing right now at the Northeast Center with some of the species in this region that is employing very similar approaches. I want to change track now to look at ecosystem modeling. Food web and ecosystem models have really diversified and I would say come of age in the last couple of decades. Increasing numbers of applications. Rather than the, say, stock assessment models which I just talked about, these models tend to be used in a heuristic, at the moment at least, in a heuristic sense to try and understand system behavior and system responses to drivers. And in a management context, some have also been used as a sort of a strategic support for assessment and management strategies. But the focus here is a little broader. We're not looking at individual species per se, perhaps, maybe communities and populations. And we're also perhaps not looking at quite such a fine detail of necessary management response. So as with single species models, these models are very diverse, including many mechanisms. One trend that has been happening is, rather than look at use these models to look at biological responses and only say fishing, there's an increasing tendency to look at the larger, how these fit in a more holistic sense, in the larger picture, both with other environmental and ecological factors, but also the human side of socio-ecological systems. And so one trend is to use something called management strategy evaluation in a whole of system modeling framework to try and test the performance not only of fisheries management strategies on the ground for individual species, but strategies for managing multiple uses, and that perhaps includes models for social dynamics and actual models for the management actions itself, as well as the model of the natural resource. Ocean acidification in ecosystem models. There are a few examples from both typical food web models, which largely focus on upper trophic levels with some consideration of lower trophic levels, and then also end-to-end models, so-called end-to-end models, which try and model the whole of the system, perhaps not to the detail in the previous slide, but try and integrate the effects of both climate and environment on the ecology, and also various different human uses. The majority of examples for putting acidification have, as with the single species approaches, tended to focus on a sensitivity type approach, so assume an effect on a particular life history parameter for some species, say mortality or productivity, and then play out that scenario in the ecosystem or food web model and evaluate what the consequences of that are relative to a situation where, or a model run where there was no acidification. There's some more elaborate work that has been done by the Australians, which has specifically involved identifying and parameterizing functional relationships between physical parameters and biological responses. And this has been done in a larger, broader context rather than just ocean acidification. So I'm not really going to talk about some of that work right today, but I definitely point you towards some of Beth Fulton's work here to try and look at, in that case, they're evaluating what they call futures for Australia in the marine environment, and that's been a lot of work using a blend of modeling approaches, whereas a lot of the more specific system-related work has been using one or two specific models. The California Current work in the North Pacific has included a model called Atlantis, and also EcoPath with Ecosim, and these papers have looked at again changes in fisheries yield when there are modeled effects of ocean acidification versus changes when they're not. The striped bars here represent abundance when there was acidification, and versus not. And you can see that there's differential responses for various things. What Isaac Kaplan found, which has been a familiar story, is that you see both reductions in biomass of things that are directly modified by OA within the food web model, but also for things that rely on those species. And so an advantage of a food web model then, or an ecosystem model, is that we can start to look at the indirect effects of ocean acidification on food web and ecosystem components. One result from their work was that some of the catch levels that are currently considered sustainable appeared to lead to severe depletion under ocean acidification. Also in the North Pacific, there's an ecopath model of the Puget Sound food web by Shalon Bush and colleagues, and they looked at responses of the food web to perturbations in productivity associated with calcifying organisms. Those are the ones that, calcifying groups within the food web model, those are the ones that are circled in this rather horrendous food web diagram. And you can see here that at this level the modeling is really on species groups and communities rather than necessarily individual species. And so you can imagine how challenging it is then to think about what to do, how to model the effects of something like ocean acidification, which as we know is generally going to be species specific in terms of responses. And so I think at this stage with these models it's a case of looking at broad overall responses and not trying to get into too many of the weeds. What Shalon found was that the results tended to depend on which group was directly affected. What I'm showing here is changes in fisheries yield for a bunch of different species groups, and you can see, and with the different panels as being different scenarios in terms of which species were the effects of ocean acidification were modeled on, and you can see that there's substantial differences between those individual panels there, showing that the responses are highly dependent on how or what is affected by ocean acidification. They also found that both the direct and indirect effects of acidification within the ecosystem model were antagonistic and synergistic. And what I mean by that is that sometimes they found that the ecosystem response to acidification was, when you modeled effects on several species, was consistent with modeling those, adding the response up from the perturbations where you modeled those effects individually. But sometimes they found that when that there were either compensation between effects on species groups, or even more pronounced effects of ocean acidification when you model, say, effects on two types of species groups versus just one. This is a result that has also been noted in Southeast Australia, again using a model called Atlantis. And they found that acidification repeatedly tended to produce synergistic effects, in that the effects of by including ocean acidification within their model, they were getting more a greater response than would be expected just by putting ocean acidification in by itself. So that's when in concert with some other environmental drivers such as fishing and warming. The Southeast Australian work, also akin to the North Pacific work, showed the very variable responses in biomass of species groups, and a lot of sensitivity to how those things were modeled. So moving back to our region for the conclusion of this talk, our approach here has been very similar to that of the work in the North Pacific and in Southeast Australia, although we haven't gone to the full functional relationships. Here the idea here is having a set of ecosystem models that try and integrate across all the different stresses within the system. We're using a model called Atlantis, which I've already mentioned, as a model to look at those effects. Now, Atlantis is a full end-to-end system model. It includes a biophysical model that is driven by output from climate models, regional climate models. And so that is used to drive primary production and then lower trophic level production through to fisheries and protected species. It includes models then for how humans interact with that spatially explicit biophysical model, and also models things like collecting of data, modeling the actual stock assessment and management process, and then critically includes models for implementing management strategies and feedbacks of those management strategies into the biophysical system. And so this enables us to, in a larger sense, evaluate the relative performance of different scenarios. So perhaps if we change our management structure to something else, we can play this out and say, okay, well, how does changing the management structure relate to our objectives compared to perhaps hypotheses for how the biophysical model. So the Atlantis Northeast, the Northeast US implementation of Atlantis is spatially explicit. It includes about 30 spatial areas from the Northeast US. We have 45 functional groups in the ecological model, and a fairly complicated human model which includes 18 fishing fleets from various ports which have effort dynamics associated with them to try and mimic the general behaviors of the system. So the physical part of the system is driven by output from a ROMS model for the region, and then we simulate the effects of those physics on the biology and the fishing, and essentially condition our model on the behavior of the system. As I said, it's not really the focus here is on generally mimicking characteristics of the system rather than getting at specific predictions for individual components. Our initial scenarios have focused on fixed increases in mortality for some species groups, specifically calcifying benthic inverts and also some zooplankton species. I'm going to briefly show the results of one particular run as an example, and then talk about some more general results that we've seen. So the idea here is to run the model with the ocean acidification effect and then compare it to the results that we get when there is no ocean acidification. Similarly to other work, we see large responses in those species groups that are directly affected. But we also see responses in indirectly affected species. So these are species that are feeding on direct effects or that they're feeding on other things. And so you see the effects of OA transfer through the food web. In particular, we see changes in a lot of the demersal fish species and also some of the protected species. Now this also naturally translates to decreases in the magnitude of fisheries catches. This is for a scenario where we have a fixed effort over time, and we're comparing the effects of OA with the effects of OA to one without. So this doesn't necessarily have it doesn't necessarily model individual management responses to those effects, but it does allow us to see that there are substantial impacts for fisheries yield. Rather than focusing on individual species, if we look at values for ecosystem indicators and how they change with ocean acidification, we can see substantial changes that are results of ecosystem restructuring. Our work right now, we're currently working with economists within the Northeast Fisheries Science Center to couple the output of this model to a regional economic model, and the idea there is to be able to also add to this radial plot here the economic indicators such as employment and jobs in supporting industries, so not just fisheries but industries that are supporting those fishing fleets within the model. And the idea being then that we can quite clearly quantify where the trade-offs are associated with both our climate effects but also different management strategies, so playing out those models with other kinds of fishing models. What this does clearly show here on the indicators is that the reduction in demersal production, which is perhaps not too surprising given what I've just shown you. So to summarize some of these results, I think in general, although we're seeing some slightly different nuanced responses, the results that we've been finding with the Northeast Atlantis model are comparable with those elsewhere. Specifically, we can demonstrate that the effects of acidification do transfer to species that aren't directly vulnerable, and that we can see large effects on fisheries yield and biomass of the system. But it's important to note that those responses are variable depending on the magnitude of those effects that we're modeling, and so really this highlights the need for some detailed analysis and inclusion of some more specific information on the responses of individual species and populations to pH and ocean chemistry. And we're currently moving our model into a newer code base which will allow us to include some of those functional relationships between species parameters and physical parameters, which will enable us to get at some of that, to be in a point where we can actually start to integrate and synthesize some of the work from the monitoring and experiments that are going on in the region. So to summarize, really what I'd like you to take home from this talk is that yes, we have a large suite of models available in our toolbox, and that these models can be modified pretty easily to include or account for the effects of ocean acidification. When we do this, we tend to see interactions between fishing and environmental stresses, not just ocean acidification, but the exact nature of the ecosystem and population responses are highly dependent on the nuances of those effects and how we're assuming that those effects transfer to species within the models. And so I think this really shows that these models provide a framework for integrating information and understanding and evaluating the consequences of environmental effects such as acidification on the things that we might be interested in from an ecosystem and management perspective. All right, with that, I think I'll leave it and open for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.